What is a chiefdom? Cahokia.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to episode 11 of the Life in Ruins podcast. I'm your host, Carlton Gover, and as always, I'm joined by my co-hosts, Coco Johnnon and David Howe.
David S. Anderson is a Mesoamerican archaeologist with research interests including public archaeology, conceptions of heritage, origins and development of socio-political complexity, and academic engagement with pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology. He runs a very popular Twitter account at DSA Archaeology that currently has over 10.7 thousand followers and is a contributor to Forbes Science. Currently, Dr. Anderson is employed as an assistant professor of anthropology at Radford University.
Wait, isn't Radford University where Carlton got his undergraduate degree in anthropology?
Well, yes, Connor. Dr. Anderson was actually one of Carlton's first anthropology professors, and he even gave Carlton several passing grades.
Wow. So our guest today is one of the reasons why the two of us and the anthropological community has to put up with Carlton?
I mean, when you put it like that.
Well, so before this intro collapses like the post-classic period Maya, let's go ahead and get this episode started. So thank you for joining us, Dr. Anderson. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing great, Carlton. Thanks for having me on, and I apologize in advance for all of the ruin that I have caused.
I just can't read, so you're good.
I think I've done fine. I think I've done okay. So for this first part, we really just want our audience to get a relationship to what got you started in archaeology. So if you'd mind giving our listeners just a brief introduction as to who you are and what you study.
Sure. So yeah, I received my PhD in anthropology from Tulane University. The specialization in the Maya, particularly, I've had a long fascination with the pre-classic Maya and sort of, how that sociopolitical organization question, how do they go from being sort of simple village farmers into the large-scale kingdoms that we see developing in the Maya world. So I have some pretty straight-up traditional archaeological background. How I got into this is a long tumbling endeavor in so many ways. I always liked history. I always liked being outside, and so in some sense, archaeology was a good fit for me. But Carlton's probably heard me talk before. I mean, what really got my gears rolling and what makes it so great, where I really like being where I am today, talking about things like pseudoarchaeology as well, is that when I was 18 and I was heading off to college at the University of Illinois, I really didn't know what I wanted to do with my life, and I picked up a book in my local bookshop called Fingerprints of the Gods by Graham Hancock, which is this conspiracy-laden tome that's all about how professional archaeologists are sort of too narrow-minded to recognize all of these truths and mysteries right in front of their eyes. And at 18, I thought it was an amazing book, and it really fired me up. And that's literally the reason I signed up for a bunch of archaeology classes the next semester, my second semester in college, and rather quickly, I started to see that there were some problems with the claims that he was laying out in that book. But I try to keep in mind, it's how powerful these pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeological narratives can be, and how they can really draw people in and get them interested in this subject.
So Graham Hancock's definitely a popular name these days in pseudoarchaeology, I would say. So you're pretty avid on social media with like your, I guess, anti-pseudoscience. How would we say it? Like
campaign,
I don't want to say rhetoric, but campaign. I think yeah.
I was going to throw in crusade, but that might be too much.
Crusade, a little Interestingly, I had heard your name through Carlton, which we'll get to that in a second. But one of my friends, who's like pretty big on Twitter, had like sent me a tweet. Or I don't use Twitter. Sorry, he forwarded me a tweet or whatever the kids say. A tweet from you saying something about how about like the History Channel actually focuses on actual archaeology and not the pseudoscience stuff. And I was like, oh hey, I know that guy. I think through somebody. And then I texted Carlton. He was like, yeah, that was my professor at undergrad. And I was like, oh, cool. Didn't know that.
Actually, one of my favorite things, I get attacked every once in a while on Twitter because I just picked a Twitter handle and I picked my initials DSA and then put archaeology after them because there's a lot of David Andersons in this world, and it turns out that of course DSA is also widely used for the Democratic Socialist Association, something to that extent. So I get a lot of attacks for how dare I bring socialism into archaeology, and like, dudes, that's just my name. I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely unfortunate. So I guess the next question I was supposed to segue into is how has Radford changed since Carleton left?
Well, we got a whole brand new building, so that's good. I am no longer an adjunct, so that's very good as well. But we definitely miss Carleton and all of that. So it's the program has been growing. We've got a record crop of new majors this semester, and so we're trying to keep it alive. And it's not quite as much fun, but we're still trying to do some good education stuff.
Yeah. Okay.
So it sounds like things got like much better once Carleton left.
Well, can I tell tales on Carleton at all while we're here, or?
Oh,
please.
Yeah.
Please.
I totally, he was in my Principles of Archaeology class, though I'm pretty sure that was his first class with me. And it was like the entire semester. And, some students talk to you and get engaged and ask questions and whatnot. And, three-quarters, almost through the entire semester, I didn't really think he cared at all, about archaeology. He was doing fine. It's not, but then like all of a sudden in like the last couple of weeks of the semester, pretty much like this time of year as the semester's wrapping up, all of a sudden he's like, yeah, this is, he like all of a sudden jumped on board. He's like, yeah, is it your cousin who's at the National Museum of the American Indian, or is it...
Yeah, that's my first cousin. Kevin Gover is the director of the American Indian Museum in DC.
Yeah, he's all of a sudden he's like, yeah, he's super interested in this and wants to get involved in all of this and has ties and long histories in this. And I was like, oh, I just thought you were a dude in my class.
And don't forget, I've definitely for some of your classes, I think the archaeology of chiefdoms, I had a significant impact towards that class.
That is true. For all of the listeners out there, if you've not watched the startlingly amazing music video of What is a Chiefdom, that is Carleton surprised me at the last day of the semester, or with a music video homage to the entire class, which was pretty amazing. I think you worked pretty much every concept we tried to talk about that semester into a 2.5-minute music video, something like that.
Yeah, it was the entire song of What Does the Fox Say? Parodied that. And for no extra credit, or like not an assignment, I just did it and presented it. And and I have to say, I was like at this year's field school at Lynch after the podcast aired and the students were listening to it, and they're like, do you do anything else? And I was next to Dr. Casey Carlson from Augustana, and she was helping the students excavate. And I was like, yeah, well, in undergrad, I did these music videos. And I think one of the most popular is What is a Chiefdom? And Dr. Carlson started busting out laughing. She's like, that was you? And I was like, what do you mean? She taught this chiefdom course and she Googled like, what is a chiefdom? And it came up and she's like, wow, this accurately describes it. And she tells her students, now you guys are going to watch this music video and it's, about 4 minutes of your life that you won't get back. But, it kind of covers everything. So like I think it's over like 2,000 views, like, which isn't a lot, but for the fact that like,
yeah.
Yeah, I guess for the listeners who haven't heard that, we can pop a clip in right here.
State is big, fans are small, tribes are weak and states are strong. Fans go hunt, some tribes farm, and the state will take your food. Pre-show up with currency and sometimes slavery, but there's one form that no one knows. What is a chiefdom?
All right, so yeah, sorry for your ears that you had to hear that, but Carleton worked really hard on it. It's actually fantastic, and as he said,
it's
he didn't
warm
do this
and dear to my heart.
Good.
Is that how you start your classes, Alf? The chiefdom class?
I have not forced other students to watch it, I don't think, ever, but I perhaps should.
Final day kind of thing.
And then you actually even featured in one of them, I think it was Ancient Aliens Idiots, we got you to do a bit about Yeah, that too. That happened.
That did happen, and I think that also proved that even auto-tune can't give me a singing voice.
Those are interesting videos for sure. I guess to segue away from that, so we can get back onto the interview here. We just talked about the first time you kind of met Carlton, and he was your student. But a lot of questions we like to ask on the podcast, or at least I do. What is your earliest memory of like archaeology and anthropology? And like as a kid, were you really into it?
It's not particularly. It was something that by high school I started to get into, but it really fits as well with some of the things I'm doing now. If you want my first memory of someone talking about archaeology, and particularly my first memory of someone talking about stratigraphy, I have to go way back to, I think I was like 9 or 10. I had the BBC radio recordings that they had done for the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which some people may know as this fabulous classic science fiction comedy novel by Douglas Adams, but it was actually a radio show before it was even before it was a novel. And in one of the final episodes, they actually had a group of archaeologists on an alien planet trying to basically study the stratigraphy to figure out why the robots had taken over the alien planet. And I promise it sort of makes sense if you watch the whole or listen to the whole episode. But yeah, it's like goes way back. Science fiction is kind of on brand for me. I think that my first memory of archaeology is a science fiction radio show.
Oh, that's really interesting. We have, I think one of our previous episodes, Damian Kirkwood, he kind of sees a lot of in Star Trek, you kind of see a lot of that as well.
Oh, goodness, yes.
Archaeology kind of sprinklings for sure.
Yeah, Star Trek is absolutely littered from the original series. I mean, lots of people pick up Next Generation because Captain Picard's sort of like hobby was to be an archaeologist as well. But even if you go back to the original series, there's a lot of archaeology sprinkled all throughout that show.
Yeah, I really like that because one of my really good professors who I studied underneath and got me into archaeology. I think he was a Trekkie, deep down inside. But it's interesting. He called he made a little case for all his field gear, and that's something that you do in archaeology, anthropology. You make these witty little boxes or whatever tools that help you with the trade. And he calls it his tricorder case is what he called it. Which
that seems good.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, I think that's kind of helped him get into anthropology and archaeology too. So it's interesting how they overlap for sure.
Yeah, it's almost like it humanizes people.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Outer space and things like that. Yeah. So I guess you weren't on Vulcan or one of those out there planets on the final frontier, but where was your first field experience?
My first field experience was actually in the Northern Great Basin in Oregon. It was a field school with the University of Oregon, and we were digging some late archaic sites out there. And so it was one of those field schools where you don't find a lot necessarily. And so we were digging lots and lots of holes in a dry, dusty desert, and we occasionally would come across a projectile point here and there. But to me, it was a great experience. Although I didn't realize that digging through clay would be bad because we had no clay out there. But it was a great time.
Digging through clay is something that I wouldn't wish upon like a prisoner. Sometimes it can be rough.
And screening it on top of that is a whole nother kit and caboodle.
Yeah, without a water screen and anything like that. Yeah. How does the out there in Oregon compare to field work in Central America, Mexico area, Guatemala?
It was a total difference because the next year after that, I went to Yucatan, Mexico for my first time and worked for the summer at a Maya archaeological site, and it was just remarkable because in Oregon there was hardly anything on the surface. There were very few surface remains, and most of what we were finding we had to dig down about a meter to even get to. I went down to Yucatan, and all of a sudden there's just stuff everywhere, like buildings on the surface right in front of my eyes, and pottery and stone all over the surface. And so it was from the very get-go just a totally jarring experience. Digging too was sort of fun. Learning to dig in Oregon in the desert was not what we were mostly digging through sand. And so we were digging in like 5 and 10 centimeter levels that were perfectly flat and squared and all of this. And then I started digging in Yucatan, where we dig through big chunky limestone rocks, and you pull out one rock and you're like, well, I just went down 50 centimeters, I guess. And you had sort of such a trouble controlling those excavations sometimes that in comparison to what it's like to dig elsewhere. So it really stresses that role of how different geology will make our job sometimes.
So you kind of went from like two extremes,
Oh yeah, I went from literally my first archaeological experience was with an archaic hunter-gatherer excavations, and then the next one was with upper level, elite bureaucratic state sort of stuff.
Like, oh, this is what some other people do. At least a little more exciting.
So a lot of our guests in previous episodes, they've talked about some of their inspirations for archaeology and what they want to get into, and the two main ones are Egyptology and then working in Mesoamerica. And you are one of the few that works in Meso, and your wife is an Egyptologist.
Yes.
Power couple.
Yeah. And so you did your MA in anthropology at Tulane, and now did you have to write a thesis for your MA?
No, it was because I was in a PhD program and I sort of picked up the MA along the way. I did write a senior thesis as an undergrad on the Maya, in particular on the iconography of a Maya city known as Yaxchilan, which is in Chiapas, Mexico, right on the border with Guatemala. And Yaxchilan might be known to some folks because it has just stunning lintels. It has this really amazing collection of lintels that are carved lintels showing the rulers of the site carrying out bloodletting rites and other ritual events. And I spent sort of my senior year in undergrad just poring over all the Yaxchilan data I can get my hands on to try and make sense of that, because it's amazing how dense the iconographic record for the Maya can be sometimes.
Damn. I mean, the fact that you get to work in Mesoamerica is actually extraordinarily cool. And something that I remember a lot from Radford was your survey of archaeological sites in Stobo. Is that correct?
Yeah, so my PhD dissertation was on Stobo, and as a grad student, I worked on a project that was surveying Northwest Yucatan, and Stobo is one of the sites we found during that survey.
So Stobo is just one of the sites. It's not the region itself.
Yeah. Stobo is one of the largest sites that we encountered during that survey, and particularly from the perspective, it was a pre-classic site, and it was the largest pre-classic site we found that was single occupation. There's one or two contenders that also had some pre-classic occupation at them, but also were later reoccupied during the classic period. And so it becomes quite a difficult endeavor to start asking that question of how big they were during the pre-classic. But Stobo made for a fabulous dissertation project for me, because since it was never reoccupied, I didn't have to worry about teasing out all those chronological details.
Which can be super difficult in any site,
Yes.
Huge.
Why don't we go ahead and wrap up segment 1 with Dr. David Anderson from Radford University, and we will be right back after this quick break.
Welcome back to episode 11 of a Life in Ruins podcast. We are interviewing Dr. David Anderson of Radford University. This is the second section of this. And to begin with, we ended the last segment talking about some of your fieldwork in Mexico. And I was just wondering, as a plains archaeologist, I always wondered how you actually do like survey in these jungled areas and find stuff.
Good Lord. Yeah. And that's been the joke of a lot of my life. I mean, I think we mentioned my wife works in Egypt, and I've done some work with her there too. And it's like, you just see everything everywhere you go. And yeah, in the jungle, it's an entirely different endeavor. So like as a grad student, I worked on a regional survey project where we were looking for unrecorded sites. And what we ended up doing in that project, because it just the density of the forest in northern Yucatan is so great that there's no chance you can walk transects or anything like this. You would be there forever. And so we ended up doing an informant-based survey for that project. And so we would, pull into town and start talking to local individuals everywhere we went, meet with the appropriate political officials, and then we would sit down and, have a drink and talk with people who were farmers and hunters and people who spent a lot of time in the woods. And we would gradually over this is a 3-year-long project. We would cultivate different informants who were familiar with or aware of different archaeological sites in the woods, and then they would take us out there. And it was always an interesting experience because here we are, foreigners tumbling into very small communities in rural Mexico, asking to be taken to piles of rocks in the woods, and everybody was very confused. And they sometimes people would say like, well, there's nothing big here, and we're like, yeah, we don't need to see the big stuff. We want to see little villages. We want to talk about everyday life. And so we had to really have long conversations with people a lot of times to explain why we were there and what we were interested in. And so ultimately we found a ton of sites on that survey. It was a really interesting project to work on because we had the directors of the project had set us up to start surveying Northwest Yucatan, and their plan was to work across the entirety of the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. We were going to, just move, down the road every season and get another stretch of coast in. And basically, we never left the northwest corner of the peninsula over the 3 years because we found so many sites. We went before the survey. There were about I have to double check my numbers for sure, but there were about 40 or so sites that were known in the region prior to our survey. And the directors thought we'd find like 20, 30 more and move on. And we ended up finding 300 some odd sites more. And so we just never got out of this space because we just kept talking to these guys and saying, what do you know? And they're like, hey, I've got another site for you. And they'd take us out. And sure enough, we just kept finding site after site after site. And so it's, we had a lot of talks about it back in the day, and this is not a systematic survey in any scientific or sampling sense. And so Lord knows how much more is out there because there's just so much space we could not feasibly get to. If there were not trails or dirt roads, it would just take us so long to actually get to them. In fact, there was one site that we always wanted to go to because one of the directors of the project, Tony Andrews, went to a site back in the 70s along the coast. And he had been taken there. But Tony had these fabulous field stories that you just would not believe. And back in the 70s, they were friends with a helicopter pilot. and so the helicopter pilot would take them places when they had a little money for fuel for his helicopter. And they were just cruising along the coast of Northwest Yucatan and saw a site out in the wetlands near the coast and popped down, and Tony scooped up some pottery, and that was all. They were running out of gas and there was a storm coming in, so he jumped back up into the helicopter and they zoomed off. And so Tony was sort of obsessed with getting back to this site. And we spent 2 years talking with some folks that lived along the coast, trying to get them to take us to this site. And they knew it. There were some guys who were duck hunters and they were duck hunter guides too. So they would take people out along the wetlands all the time. But it was just so remote and so wet that they never would take us. They kept saying, well, come back next month, it might be drier, or come back next month, it might be wetter and we can take a boat. And there was just never in a place where we could actually get out to this site. The best part, though, is you can almost see it on Google Earth because there's a crashed airplane near it. And
oh, wow.
the airplane it is absolutely beautiful. It's this crashed, little, I don't know airplane. I'm going to say Cessna. It's probably not a Cessna, but some little plane crashed in this wetland. And the duck hunter guides had a photo of the airplane, and it had the crappiest stencil of U.S. Air Force on the side of this plane that, one look at, and you're like, that is not a U.S. Air Force plane. And so we were
US
pretty
Air Force
convinced that
was
some sort of smuggling operation airplane crash out in the wetlands there.
Oh, wow. That's really interesting. And it seems like these communities that you go into kind of are, I wouldn't say the backbone, but they become this this huge body of knowledge that you can talk and use to learn about these areas.
Absolutely. I mean, this was a fundamental critical resource to how we were doing this work. We were, reliant upon local knowledge of these sites and an ongoing conversation. Because, as I said, they were kind of confused why we wanted to see these piles of rocks in the woods. They did not have a strong sense of personal or cultural connection to these sites. They were familiar with them and had some awareness that people had lived there, but they didn't see them as direct ancestry sites or places. And so there were a lot of strange conversations days where we had several informants who just really wanted to take us to big mounds, and every time we would drive down a road, and whenever we drove down any road or walked down any path, we would just have our eyes peeled for any sign of a site, because Yucatan it's flat as a pancake. It's geologically speaking, it's very similar to Florida, and so anytime you see any kind of bump on the horizon, you've got a structure or a platform of some kind. And so we would stop over and over again and tell people hey, we want to see these. These are houses. This is where people used to live. And I really remember one guide one day, because this guy we'd been working with for about a week, and he'd been taking us to these really big sites that he knew. And we stopped on the side of the road, said, hey, we're really interested in this. There's a couple of house mounds here. We want to see stuff like this too. And he laughed. He's like, that stuff's everywhere. and sure enough, he spent like another 2-3 months taking us to little house sites, every day for like 2-3 months in a row, because there was just so many of these things all over the place in Yucatan. It was a remarkable site. Some of the listeners might be familiar with, there's a lot of LiDAR surveys coming out right now that are showing just how dense the occupation of the Maya world was. And this is something that we've had glimpses of. We've known that the density of human occupation in this tropical rainforest is just through the roof. But the LiDAR is exposing it in a way that was nearly impossible to do beforehand, because we were chasing down these dirt trails and dirt roads, and we could just barely come up with these things. Now that we're having these technological advancements, we're really going to be able to start seeing just how dense this settlement was.
I have a quick question. I'm really interested in the idea that you want to look at the everyday and the ordinary in like a big civilization like that, just like a house. What does a Neolithic, like Mesoamerican, household kind of look like at that time?
Sure. So, I'm particularly interested in the pre-classic, which is this sort of early farming communities. Quasi-Neolithic in that sense. And a lot of these small sites, the small pre-classic sites that we would find the remnants of, probably 4 to 5 small house platforms. And so, the community, that's what we could see from a stone platform perspective. And
sure.
It's really hard to grow much past that and say, how many people were here is tough to say. If we look at, modern Maya communities, it's really common for there to be sort of a central large house in a family group, and for lots of, smaller outbuildings and to make up sort of a whole house compound of sorts. And you would see a lot of household gardens that go side by side with that. So we have a presumption that the standard Maya house, and that you'll have one large house, lots of small outbuildings, and a large area that is dedicated to orchard for growing fruit trees and other household plants for a household garden. But it's hard to know in the pre-classic, those are things that do not survive well in the archaeological record. So the distribution of the stone platforms that we found certainly seems to plausibly fit into that household model, but it's pretty hard to say at this point.
That's just really interesting. I just like knowing about how everyday people lived. That's cool.
One of the really fascinating, one of my favorite things that we found on this project is that we ended up encountering 25 sites out of all of these that had ball courts at them. The Maya used to play a ball game with a rubber ball and sort of a hip ball. You had to bounce it back and forth off your hip to one another. And the literature before our project, and still to this day, a lot of the Maya ball game literature really heavily emphasizes a notion that this is an elite practice, that this is a ritual practice, that there's all kinds of deep, profound significance to this game. And I don't think that's wrong. But what we found on these surveys, we found these 25 ball courts, and virtually all of them were at really small sites like this. So we would find, a site with 7, 8, 9 houses and a ball court. And there, we were finding ball courts at sites where there was nothing in any way, shape, or form that looked like elite architecture or sort of higher echelons of socio-political complexity. And it really got the wheels turning for me in talking about, and so I've published some articles about this notion that maybe, yes, later on during the classic period, there is an elite political ritual theater version of this game. But it actually looks like we have some good evidence that there is just community building, small scale game playing going on too.
Huh. Like Brooklyn.
I had one off of that topic alone. One of the first professional talks I ever watched or listened to, sat in on, was yours at SAAs in San Francisco, where you talked about that subject. And personally, I have taken that research. I actually talked about it last week to one of my classes because we're talking about complex civilization in Mesoamerica. And one of the concepts that I tell my students in the concept of entertainment is I use that research that you brought up about ball courts being at village sites. And I make the analogy to my students. I'm like, is the NFL the only place where American football is played? And they look at me like I'm an idiot. Like, what are you talking about? I'm like, this isn't a hard question. Like, who else plays football? Then everyone's like, college, high school. And I'm like, exactly. So even in the past, there's these modern day analogies that we can make between some of these ancient civilizations and modern day civilizations. And I use that ball court analogy. It's like, I had a professor and this is what he found, that they're found at small sites. So like, are these elites playing it? Probably not. It's probably, everyday people enjoying a sport.
Absolutely. That's fantastic because it highlights too, brings up to mind for me, we have Thanksgiving coming up here in the U.S. And there's, this strong tradition of families playing sort of a light touch football game in the backyard after dinner. And that game is a social bonding ritual, but it also involves no court whatsoever. And so, that signal, and this is what we've sort of been aware of with the Maya ball game for a long time, we can find it when we can find stone courts where it was played, but they didn't need those stone courts to play this game. And so there's sort of no telling how common this game was in that sort of backyard, informal schoolyard kind of way. It could have been just about everywhere, and it's going to be very hard for us to be able to pick that up from an archaeological signature.
Exactly. And another thing that I've taken from your class is one of the first times that you show us Chichen Itza, you're like, does anyone know what this is? And everyone's like, no. And you're like, this is the rebel base from Star Wars. And,
wait, no. Tikal, not Chichen.
No.
PhD student. Come on.
Yeah, PhD student. But interestingly enough, even though it's not Chichen, you have worked at Chichen Itza, which is one of the more like prominent sites in Mexico.
Yeah, I got a chance to work there for a couple of weeks. Some good friends and colleagues of mine were running a project there, and so I got to play archaeological tourist and join them for a couple of weeks.
Oh, that's amazing. That's one of the things that inspired me to get into archaeology, is just the beauty and the monumentalness of that place.
Yeah, Chichen Itza is an absolutely phenomenal place to see. I mean, it was one of the largest Maya cities in the northern lowlands. It would have been, I think it's almost 20 square kilometers at this point, and would have been a huge urban sprawl, basically. And at the heart of it, you have one of the most iconic Maya pyramids, the pyramid of Kukulkan, or the Castillo, as the Spanish called it, where you have this beautiful 9-layered step pyramid with 4 staircases going on all sides, and has become quite a draw for tourists around the equinox, too, because there's a fantastic hierophany or shadow and light effect, whereas the sun sets on the equinox, you see sort of this serpent of light descending the stairways of the pyramid at Chichen.
Oh yeah, I really wish I could go there during that time, but it's usually a tourist draw, like you were saying. But I remember it being just so expansive. Like I had never seen anything that large, and I think I was like 10 or 11. And I was like exhausted at the end of
there. And there's just, it keeps going on and on. I will admit, I guess I'm doing this on the record, but while I was there, I was able to sort of see some places that aren't normally open to tourists. And there's a group, I believe the group's called the Temple of the Long Count. There's a building, it's the group of the Initial Series. That's what it is. There are very few monuments with Maya long count calendar dates. So the Maya long count calendar is the famous calendar that some people decided was going to end the world back in 2012. But there aren't a lot of those dates in Chichen or any of the northern lowland sites. But there's one at this group of the Initial Series, and that group had interestingly been heavily excavated and restored, but for financial reasons was never open to tourists. And so I was able to sneak back there and check it out. It's phenomenal. There's this beautiful, just circular platform that was built as a turtle. So it's this nice circular platform with a turtle head on one side and a tail on the other, and little legs sticking out. It's just, that site just goes on. And a lot of Maya sites, I feel like there's a little bit more uniformity, whereas you move from one part of the site to the other, they're building things with more similarity to it. But Chichen is just one of these places where it seems like every group at the site is built with a different flair and a different style. So it is the site that just keeps on giving if you're a tourist and want to go see. It's just, there's an amazing amount of stuff there.
Are there any duck effigies present?
Any duck effigies?
Yeah, like quack.
I think I have missed an inside joke of some kind. I don't think we have any good ducks at all in Maya art, actually.
Oh, well, that's about. We had a conversation about that. I guess
we had a spat more. I would say.
Yeah, more of a spat about southwest or southeast duck effigies.
Southwest. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So. Yep, that happened. Anyways,
I think we're gonna duck out of this episode, this section real quick, and we'll catch you on the far side.
All right, so we're back with section 3 of episode 11 of a Life in Ruins podcast, here with our guest, Dr. David Anderson. Now, before we begin, I do want to give you a shout out, Dr. Anderson, because a small conversation that you and I had during your chiefdom course has actually launched my research interests. And you probably don't remember it, but I bring it up at all my talks as an introduction.
Oh my!
And when we were talking, you showed us a map of the distribution of different chiefdom cultures, and one of them is the Caddoan chiefdom, which is the only Mississippian chiefdom culture west of the Mississippi. And after class, I came up to you and I asked about it, and you didn't have much familiarity, and I made a mention to you as well, I've always heard that the Pawnee are related to the Aztecs or descendants of the Aztecs because of this ritual sacrifice. And you very carefully told me, no, that's not the case based on linguistics and the time frame. And that question alone kind of got me thinking about what I want to do. I was like, well, because I had figured that at that young point in my career, I think I was probably a junior in undergrad when I took that course. I'm like, well, where did the Pawnee come from? Because I just assumed that the archaeological record, someone had known that there had to be someone who knew where the Pawnee had come from. And just on limited research that I've done, I realized two things. One, the Great Plains isn't well investigated, has, for the largest geographic region, has the least amount of archaeologists. And then two, no one has really actually been investigated where tribal nations have come from past the cultural historical approach. And that was when I applied to my master's at Wyoming, that was the question I wanted to answer. I was like, I want to know where the Pawnee came from. So I have to give you props because that one conversation propelled me to basically, spending a considerable amount of time and energy and money into figuring out that question, and has kind of become the basis of my career, because that was what my master's thesis was on, and that's what my dissertation is still continuing on, is answering this one question that resulted from just a brief conversation that I had with a professor of mine in undergrad.
Well, that's fabulous. It's amazing to hear that, really, and it's been great to see you go on and do such good work. And it's a fantastic question, right? I mean, the move, as you know, that studying the movement and development of people through archaeological material alone is pretty difficult. And so it's really great to see, people taking this seriously and you moving on with this subject and this question.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely just wanted to give you that shout out. And I bring it up all the time. Every time I start a presentation, I'm like, so this is the background to why this started. But for the purpose of this podcast, where we like to introduce and talk to young professionals in the field of archaeology and anthropology, you have, between the years of 2012 to the present, has been rather interesting in terms of your professional career, and that you've been teaching at the three major academic institutions in Southwest Virginia: Radford University, Virginia Tech, and Roanoke College. So would you like to describe to our listeners that whole process of becoming an assistant? You're now an assistant professor. You're good.
I am now an assistant professor, yes, as of 6 months ago or so.
So there was a 6 month year period where that was not guaranteed. So would you like to kind of describe that process to our listeners?
Sure. I know we've talked about this before outside of the podcast and whatnot. I mean, the career track in archaeology, it can be very difficult, and especially if you are interested in the academic side of archaeology. I graduated from Tulane University, which is a pretty darn good institution, in 2010 with my PhD. And I had I had two publications to my name, and one of them in a top tier peer-reviewed journal at that point. And I had a ton of conference presentations, and I had teaching experience as a grad student. I had taught several classes. And so I graduated from Tulane knowing that the job market was tough, but thinking that, I've got a pretty decent resume. I've directed my own project in Mexico. I have lots of field experience. I had publications. I had all that sort of stuff. And then, I met the job market, and it was just terrifying. Ultimately I was, nominally on the job market from 2010 all the way through to this last year, trying to look for a full-time teaching position somewhere. As much as I love field work, the classroom is something that I love equally, and so there are other options out there in archaeology for employment, particularly in the cultural resource management world. But I was very passionately interested in being involved in education. And it's just to be blunt, during the time period that I was on the job market, there would be, in a good year, there would be about 20 or so jobs I could apply to nationwide. And usually most of those were a stretch where I'd be like, oh yeah, I totally do environmental archaeology. Hey, I've got one paper on soil analysis. I'm an environmental archaeologist. I'll apply to that job. And it was rough. It was really, really, there are not a lot of academic jobs right now, basically. I mean, quite literally, I graduated with my PhD studying the Maya. And since I graduated in 2010, there has been, I believe, just one, maybe two tenure track jobs for specifically looking for a Maya specialist since I graduated. So I very quickly realized by 2010, 2011 that I needed to diversify my credentials if I wanted to be to be able to stand out in some way, shape, or form on this job market, because there are lots of other Maya archaeologists out there. There's quite a few of us, in fact, and we're all doing good work and doing some very interesting things. But with no Maya archaeology jobs, that's really is a big part of what pushed me to start doing formal research on pseudoarchaeology and pseudoarchaeological claims, so that I could define myself in some way, shape, or form as on that academic platform as more than a one-trick pony, if you will. And I think that's for people looking at the academic job market and wanting to move in that direction. I think that is vital. That you can't just be your dissertation. Like your dissertation was hard and it was a lot of work, and I understand that and I acknowledge that. And in a better world, perhaps your dissertation and the amazing work you did on it would be enough to get you a job. But there are 200 to 300 people with PhDs on the job market every year looking for these academic archaeology teaching jobs. And so I think it's fundamentally vital that people need to find a way to stick out in that whole pile.
Well, I know there was a moment, my last year at Radford, you were no longer an adjunct professor. Mm-hmm. And we had brought you in for a talk. The anthropology club did. And I remember afterwards we were talking and we're like kind of just chatting with you about your job prospects. You had just had a baby girl and you were struggling to find an academic job in archaeology. And I remember you didn't really like CRM. I mean, because you had a family at that point and CRM requires you to be out and about. And you,
I wouldn't say I don't like CRM, but I would say that I wanted to be with my family. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And you had mentioned that you were thinking about like dropping out of archaeology to get a desk job in order to support your family. And that scared the living hell out of me in terms of like my prospects for the future. Cause we had, a professor at Radford that has a lot of publications and did very well and came from Tulane. And the fact that you were struggling was like, what are my prospects? If Wyoming accepts me, and to their credit, they did, or to their unfortunate, they did. and so like, could you describe like that kind of realization that everything that you'd kind of worked for at that point, like the considerable amount of schooling that you'd had to have either take a break or just drop out altogether?
Yeah, it was terrifying. It really was for me, where I had devoted 10 years of my life to getting a PhD, and years before that getting involved in archaeology, and then years of teaching after that, because I managed to stay employed teaching, as you mentioned earlier, not just Radford, but I was teaching adjuncting at Radford and adjuncting at Roanoke College as well as Virginia Tech, and was sort of doing this academic dance from one job and position to another. And trying to keep that resume alive from a teaching perspective, and trying to keep it alive from a publication perspective, and all that process too. And it was, there were many moments where, I actually quit Radford at one point. Actually, I guess you probably don't know this. I deliberately quit Radford because there came a point where they asked, in essence, and it was not the department that I'm in now. It was not the wonderful folks that I teach with now and that you remember, but I was asked to teach 4 classes a semester at Radford as an adjunct between 2 different departments. And that was a full-time load for full-time professors. And and as an adjunct, I would have been getting paid less than half of the money those other professors were getting paid, and I would have gotten no benefits whatsoever. And I quit, and it was that was the end of my dream. I really did think that this career that I wanted. I walked away from because I wasn't willing to let an institution sort of take advantage of me in that way. And luckily enough, like a couple of weeks later, a full-time job opened up at Roanoke College, and I was able to get that job for 2 years. And then by the time that job ended, there was Dr. Fox, actually, one of our other archaeologists in our department at Radford, became faculty senate president, which has embroiled him in all kinds of bureaucracy that I'm not sure he enjoys every day. But since he became faculty senate president there, he had some course releases, and that enabled Radford to hire me on a full-time basis. Well, full-time as in I was teaching a full load and getting benefits and whatnot, but it was a 1-year contract, and we got that contract renewed for a second year. And then just this fall, this last summer, I was hired as an assistant professor, tenure track professor at Radford, and it was remarkable. I still don't quite believe that it's actually happening, that I have some job stability here, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I mean, I've been teaching for the last 7 years straight, and for 4 of those 7 years, I was employed full time with benefits and whatnot. And I know lots of my friends and colleagues who have had harder and more difficult roads in trying to find employment in the academy, and it's one of those things that I think it's important to talk about these issues, and I'm glad we're talking about these issues because it sucks. And it's at the same time, I don't regret like going into this profession or trying to get these jobs. There was never a moment where I was like, damn, I shouldn't have spent the last 10 years in grad school. There was always a damn, I want to keep doing this somehow. And this is, part of and parcel of how I started up on Twitter and how I ended up writing for a couple of different websites, because I was afraid and pretty, certain that my academic career was going to end. And so I was looking for a way to build a public journalism and archaeology journalism career, in essence, in some way, shape, or form, that I could still keep talking about these issues to the public. It's if you're doing this, the people listening, I love this career. I think obviously you guys love this career, but it is important to be honest about how few jobs there are in the professorate right now. And that's not about to change anytime soon. And so this is a very important consideration of how you can use your career and your experience flexibly, because anyone getting a graduate degree or a PhD, you have phenomenal research skills, you have phenomenal writing skills, and the academy is not the only place where those skills can be put to use.
Yeah, I'm just so glad to hear that said in a sentence. It's nice to hear.
Yeah, because we hear a lot how toxic the job market can be at times, and like rushing for it, and like to have a professor voice those concerns and like what goes on at the university level administratively is just phenomenal. And I remember, I think it was like on Facebook or something, like Dr. Fox, I remember when that position opened, and I'm pretty sure it's basically meant for you. I know they opened it up and then they asked students, like, who should we hire? And like everybody was like, well, you're going to hire Dr. Anderson, right? Like there's no, why would we hire anybody else? Like that's just crazy. Cause like the Radford department is it's small. It's you, Dr. Cassidy Urista, Dr. Jake Fox, Dr. Donna Boyd, and then Dr. Cliff Boyd. And then is it Maury? Is he still around?
Darcy Morey. Darcy Morey's a research associate with the department. Yeah, he's still around.
Okay. Yeah, I remember hearing one of his talks.
Yeah, he does some fabulous zoo archaeological work with domestication of dogs, but he doesn't teach for us. Okay.
Gotcha. No, like I'm super happy because I remember that moment where you told us that, and like it straight up broke my heart that you were thinking about leaving the field, because you're one of the, I'm pretty sure actually you taught me how to do archaeology, because it was the intro to it was like methods 1 and you taught methods 2.
Yeah, and then you had field school with me too.
Yeah, the chieftain class was interesting because it was like the first, like, I guess it was almost like a grad class, because it was like 6 of us. We talked about articles for an hour and a half and concepts, and that was like new. And then then you taught me how to be a field archaeologist at field school. So you're the reason why everyone has to deal with me.
It's fantastic, Connor. I mean, it's been really a pleasure to see you go on and do so well.
Oh yeah, no, totally appreciate it. And I think what we're going to do here is, because the content that we talked with you is phenomenal. I think for the first time ever, we're going to go ahead and wrap section 3 up, and then go ahead with maybe one time only section 4, because we want to get into your science communication, because that is also important, that we believe our listeners should hear. So why don't we just go ahead? Let's go ahead and like wrap up section 3. We'll be right back, everybody. Hopefully we don't get in too much trouble with our producer, Chris, who has left us alone also for the first time. Our Webster Dictionary isn't available. So we're just going to go ahead and wrap this up, and we'll be back for section 4 of A Life in Ruins podcast, episode 7. Welcome back to episode 11 of A Life in Ruins podcast. Here we are with episode 11 of A Life in Ruins podcast. We're here with Dr. David Anderson, assistant professor at Radford University, and this is our special segment 4. And so we really wanted to keep Dr. Anderson on for this segment, because he's rather prominent in the science communication realm. And a little fun bit, Dr. Anderson, you had a student ask you a pretty interesting question the other day, huh?
Yeah, in fact, it was just the other day. I had one of the students in my 101 class who sat down in my office, and we were talking about this, that, and the other. And he said, "Oh, by the way, have you heard about this podcast, A Life in Ruins?"
And what praises did you heap upon us?
Well, I said, that's actually, one of the guests was one of my students and was actually a Radford alum and everything. So the student was quite impressed, I think. So, you guys are getting out there and making an impression on everybody, all the interested parties in archaeology.
The fact that I was considered impressive is just phenomenal in its own right. But anyways.
Yeah. Well, we might be getting big in these small archaeological circles, but it looks like, or you have been communicating in the Twitter sphere, kind of using your Twitter as a way to kind of combat these Graham Hancock things. What kind of gave you the original idea to branch into that? I know you had mentioned the Graham Hancock.
Yeah. So, I mean, I made a decision back in 2000, I guess that would be about 2017, 2016, to get on Twitter sort of explicitly as a place to do public outreach. It was a platform that appealed to me in sort of the quickness and the flexibility of it. I've done some blogging here and there, and I think blogging is great. And I've I've been on quite a few different podcasts at this point too, and I think podcasting is phenomenal, and it's been an incredible way to reach out to people on this discipline. But Twitter sort of spoke to me as a great place to start, and yeah, I just started working on like saying, you know what? I mean, I think the biggest thing, about archaeology is that we're being beaten in the public media landscape by pseudoscience practitioners. This is something that astonishes me. There's a survey that I use in my classes and talk about with some regularity that was done by Chapman University. And they ask about some paranormal beliefs in this survey. And they ask about things like ancient aliens and Atlantis. And as of 2018, 41% of Americans said that they believe in ancient aliens. 41%, and that number has doubled in like the last 4 years too from this particular survey. I mean, for crying out loud, when do we get 41% of Americans agreeing on just about anything nowadays? But to me, this is like shocking. Like this means that 41% of Americans think that our profession is either lying to them or that we're all just a total bunch of idiots. Because there's no proof whatsoever for this this ancient alien concept. It's worse with Atlantis. Actually, the Atlantis question is bizarre, but the survey answers from 2018, I believe it's 57% of Americans believe that Atlantis. And here's the problem. Their question says Atlantis or something like it exists. And so I think there's some latitude there where the respondents might lump in things like ancient Egypt and say like, well, yeah, that was this big ancient complex civilization. So I think there's some issues to be pulled apart there. But the reality is, I mean, we are losing the public relations battle. And that is something that I wanted to step onto Twitter. And I've been very fortunate. I mean, I've been really and I've enjoyed Twitter. It's a place that I actually find some fun, and I think it's a fabulous and important. Social media gets lambasted all the time nowadays, but it is a place where we can actually have direct conversations between professionals and interested lay people in a world. And I've been lucky to grow my presence from there. I've written for several websites since then, and I have a standing gig with Forbes as a contributor to write for Forbes website now, which has given me a chance to write about archaeology for the public. And I got into a spat with Megan Fox, basically, and that got me a Washington Post piece. So, it's if you get out there and put yourself out there and talk about these things in comprehensive ways, we really can reach out and make a difference on these issues.
Yeah. Dang. That company I was telling you about earlier is the company that produces her show.
Hold on.
Of course.
When you say spat with Megan Fox, like you and Megan Fox went at it over Twitter.
She has never responded to me, no. She does have a Twitter feed, and I would tag her and try to draw some attention to this issue, but she doesn't really use her Twitter feed. So, but of course, since she's, Megan Fox, she has something like 1 million followers, and we tried to raise this issue. And, ultimately this is something that surrounded that Fox herself was interested in starting a new TV show. And there had been several press releases about this show that ended up being called Legends of the Lost. And I was deeply concerned, and this was something that, I think the way archaeology is being presented to the public is of profound importance. And there were a lot of telltale signs in how the show was being promoted and announced that they were going to be in some territory that I would say that they're on thin ice, where they were clearly talking about some conspiracies and some mystery mongering. And that there was a pretty heavy overlay of distrust for the academy in all of this. There was some interest in ancient aliens and all of this. And Megan Fox's personal spiritualism was sort of clearly sort of edging into this in some ways too. And I think, it's that spiritualism aspect that really drew me to say, like, I want to be able to help this. She, especially as the show aired and how it came out, her own personal spiritual beliefs were very much on show. And she, broadly speaking, is in line with something that, people might recognize as New Age spiritualism or New Age spirituality. And this is something I have familiarity with. I mean, I was raised in and around New Age spiritualism. I've done research on the relationship between New Age spirituality and the ancient past and the archaeological record. And this is a needle that can be thread, basically. I think that there are, legitimate ways where we can talk about what does the archaeological record mean to different people? How do we have different stakeholders in archaeology? And, where is the line of cultural appropriation in all of this? I think there are some lines and delicate balances that can be had here. But unfortunately, I tried to reach out to the production company and there was no response. And I was, ended up just being sort of a rebel rouser on Twitter. And unfortunately, the way this show aired, it did ultimately, I just said they were on thin ice at times. I think they actually fell through the ice more than a few times, where they just blended and blurred together legitimate, good archaeology. They had some great archaeologists on that show, but then they took that data and blended it in with conspiracy theories and giants and all of this mysticism that ultimately I think leaves the audience confused, to where they don't know where the information is coming from. They don't know what's reliable and not reliable in a show like this. And so I think this is why I'm on Twitter. This is why I write public science, archaeology articles. We need better science communication in archaeology. And as long as we have shows like this, we're going to have audiences that are fundamentally confused about what archaeology is and isn't.
To piggyback off that, with Graham Hancock like books and with shows like that come on History and Discovery and Travel Channel, where they say archaeologists don't want you to know or archaeologists aren't aware of, like, it just creates a distrust in overall science. Then is what's something I've noticed, and that's dangerous to me. But
absolutely, there's a very direct threat, and and Hancock has been very vocal about this, that archaeologists, as far as he's concerned, are the enemy. He's talked about archaeologists trying to cover up information or to selectively control what information gets out there because they don't want to admit to other bits of information. Hancock very specifically has developed a messaging strategy that basically says, don't trust them, trust me.
Yeah.
And that, we should get all information from him instead. And unfortunately, he gives you an extremely myopic view of archaeological data. He takes one or two things, pulls them right out of context, offers no critical analysis of what they might represent, like the Suruti Mammoth site, and just shoves it down people's throat and says, trust me and trust no one else in this whole process. And that is a very dangerous, toxic mix for how we can communicate science.
Yeah, and you can almost see that, I feel like in the political sphere as well. You could say that, not to get too political, but you could say that Donald Trump is the same way. He wants everyone to get their information from him, and then he tells them what's real, what's false, what's stuff like that. And it's fundamentally, like you're saying, it's dangerous to a society as a whole.
Absolutely. And this is something that I argue very strongly in the classroom. I teach a class on paranormal belief, and I talk about the pseudoarchaeology stuff. Like in the classroom, in my paranormal class, the core of that class is that we're not reading one side. We're reading, everybody here. We're going to talk about what the believers say. We're going to read from their mouth. We're going to talk about what the skeptics say about paranormal claims. We're going to, look at every single angle to this. And I think that's fundamentally what we have to do in all aspects of our life these days. I don't want Graham Hancock banned and never to be allowed to write again. For crying out loud, go read his books. But then please, after you read his books, go read an actual archaeology book. This is, I think we said at the beginning here, like, I got into this field because I read one of his books and I was fascinated. But when I learned about archaeology, this, I think the most fundamental thing, when I read his book, Fingerprints of the Gods, he presented archaeologists as this myopic little world that, couldn't see past their noses, and that they were all stubborn and just narrow-minded. And as soon as I met actual archaeologists, that perspective just faded. I mean, he absolutely has no real relationship with that real archaeologists. And archaeologists as a community are fundamentally engrossed with the idea of new data and new interpretations and how we can better understand the world. We don't rule anything out categorically until we look at it. And it's fundamentally, he presents a false perspective of the field. And so that's where it's like, don't trust him, don't trust me. Read us both and look at the data and think about it and carry it out.
Jesus, I don't know where to go from there.
I don't know. I think that's.
That was so articulate and so well spoken. Like I am thinking of poster quotes right now.
So I think in tweets now, I believe so.
What is it? 100? Is it 240 characters or 160?
I think it's up to 240.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on and speaking with us.
Yeah, this has been amazing.
I appreciate it. I greatly appreciate you guys. It's really phenomenal to see Carlton going on. Like, having seen you grow up and move through this field is fabulous. And so I'm really happy to be a part of this. And I'm really glad you guys are doing this. We need more archaeology being talked about in the public sphere. We fundamentally do. Yeah,
absolutely phenomenal. And now I know I just definitely want to say thank you. Ever since I graduated, I've seen you every year, either at essays, and then when I go I go to Radford way too frequently, and I always make sure to say hello. So this has been great. And would you like to tell our listeners all your social media handles that they could follow you and find you at?
Absolutely. I've tried to corner the market on DSA Archaeology. So I'm on Twitter as DSA Archaeology. I'm on Facebook as DSA Archaeology. And I've even got an Instagram, although I'm not sort of super active there. But you can find me on all of the social media platforms. And then I have a authors page on Forbes under David Anderson at Forbes, where I'm publishing as much as I can. It's been a little overwhelming with the classes of late, but I will have new articles on Forbes sometimes here soon, and you can see all the back catalog. So yeah, you can find me all over the internet these days.
Fantastic. And I guess our last question that we ask every guest, as this is a Life in Ruins podcast, if you could choose to do it again, would you live a life in ruins?
Forever and always, my life will be ruined.
Best answer we've had.
Perfect. Well, all right, everyone. We just interviewed Dr. David S. Anderson, an assistant professor at Radford University. And with that, we are out. Thanks for listening to A Life in Ruins podcast.
You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook at A Life in Ruins Podcast, and you can also email us at alifeinruinspodcast@gmail.com.
And remember, make sure to bring your archaeologists in from the cold and feed them beer. Hey guys.
What's up?
Why did a Mayan man build a colossal structure that aligns perfectly with equinoxes and cardinal directions, but was so far away from anything else?
Dr. Anderson, do you think you have the answer to this one?
I think because he could do it.
Well, he felt alienated in his own community and wanted to add some extraterrestrial lands to what he owned.
Oh God. Well, perfect. Thank you, Connor.
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
State is big, bands are small, tribes are weak and states are strong. Fans go hunt, some tribes farm, and the state will take your food. Pre-show up with currency, and sometimes slavery. But there's one form that no one knows. What is a chiefdom? Surface says it's redistribution, rent through as accumulation. Pocket Dot says it's all irrelevant. What is a chiefdom? Monuments and stratified, more goods buried when people die. Chiefs on mounds placed way up high. What is a chiefdom? Is it network? We don't know. Is it corporate? We don't know. How many people? We don't know. What is a chiefdom? Spiro trades with Mississippians. Rapa Nui built colossal heads. Crusoe wasn't really all that big. What is a chiefdom? Building mounds, trade networks, run by chiefs and their families. Growing crops in the fields. Surplus feed trap specialists. Sometimes warfare will threaten you, so you build a palisade. But if you meet a weaker tribe, will you take their town by force? Will they be a tribute? What is a chiefdom? The Celts might have had some states. Hawaii had feather capes. Olmec traded lots of jade. What is a chiefdom? Is it simple or complex? Spanish went on lots of treks. The Americas got wrecked. What is a chiefdom? Social hierarchy. People now are less free. Tlingit had moieties. What is a chiefdom? Cahokia, La Venta. What is a chiefdom? So do we really know what a chiefdom is? Is it really a thing? Can archaeology help us to see what we want to know? Will it stay a mystery? Theory is hard. Post-processual say they're too evolutionary. Are they too hard? Chiefdom. Are you out of date? Chiefdom. Are you still useful for comparison? Chiefdom.